Silas Crow grabbed the woman by the arm before she even cleared the gate. Not a warning, not a question. He just seized her, fingers digging into the sleeve of her coat like she was a stray dog that had wandered onto property it had no business touching, and shoved her sideways into the mud. She went down hard, one knee catching the frozen ground, her tin box skidding out of her hands and spinning across the yard. Every cowboy in the vicinity stopped what he was doing. Nobody said a word. Silas looked down at her with something worse than contempt, amusement. "Turn around," he said. "Go back the way you came." She didn't. If this is your first time here, welcome. And please consider subscribing to the channel so you never miss a story. Hit the like button, leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's get back to Martha Bell and the ranch she was never supposed to save. She had been walking for most of the morning, not because she lacked options, or at least that's what she told herself during the long stretches when the Colorado wind came off the ridgeline hard enough to make her eyes water and her fingers go numb inside her coat pockets. The truth, if she allowed herself to examine it plainly, was that she had run out of options some time ago. The last position had ended badly, the one before that even worse, and the one before that, the boarding house kitchen in Salida where she'd worked 3 months without complaint before the owner's wife decided she was too large to be seen carrying trays through the dining room. That one she preferred not to think about at all. What she had was a battered tin box with her mother's recipe cards inside, a change of clothes wrapped in oilcloth, and a name on a piece of folded paper. Ironwood Ridge Ranch. Wyatt Granger, proprietor. She had heard about it from a freighter who'd stopped for water at the edge of town. Big spread, he'd said. Good land. Owners decent enough, or used to be. He'd looked at her with that particular expression, not cruel, just resigned, and added that he didn't know if they were hiring. She'd thanked him anyway and kept walking. Ironwood Ridge sat at the base of a long slope, visible from half a mile out. Even from a distance, she could see that the fences needed attention. 3 of the posts along the approach road had heeled over and not been straightened. The gate was functional, but the latch had been replaced with a loop of wire. Small things. The kind of small things that accumulated into a story if you knew how to read them, and Martha Bell had spent enough years in other people's kitchens to know how. She came through the main gate with her tin under one arm and her bag over the other shoulder, taking stock of the yard. The bunkhouse to the left, the main house set back and higher, the barn beyond that. And she didn't see Silas Crow until he stepped out from behind a wagon and stopped directly in her path. He was a tall man, lean through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had probably been striking once and had since curdled into something meaner. He wore his authority the way men like him always wore it. In his posture, in the deliberate way he chewed the stem of the dead match between his teeth, in the half-second pause before he spoke that said he was deciding whether she was worth the words. "Help you?" he said. Which meant the opposite. "Martha Bell," she said. "I'm looking for Mr. Granger. I heard there might be work." He looked at her, not her face. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he's deciding whether to buy or throw away, and the assessment took approximately 4 seconds before something settled in his expression. "You cook?" he said. "I do." "Ever cooked for 40 men?" "Larger." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Where?" She listed 2 ranches and the boarding house. He listened with the expression of a man who has already reached his conclusion and is waiting for the other party to finish talking. "Well," he said, "I'll tell you what we don't need." He moved his jaw sideways, working the match. "We don't need another mouth we got to feed, and we especially don't need one that size." She didn't answer. She'd learned over the years that there were certain moments where answering cost more than it returned. That was when he grabbed her arm. He didn't do it savagely. That almost would have been better. He did it casually, the way you redirect livestock, his fingers closing around her forearm and pulling sideways, and she went off balance and the mud took her. The tin skidded. Her right knee hit the ground and pain shot up through her leg, and she tasted cold air and humiliation in equal measure. Behind her, she heard boots stop shuffling, felt eyes. Silas looked down at her without any particular heat in his face. That was the worst part. He wasn't even angry. This was just the efficient removal of an inconvenience. "Get up," he said, "and get going, before I have one of the boys carry your box back to the road for you." Martha stayed where she was for a moment, not because she couldn't rise. She was taking inventory, checking whether anything was hurt beyond bruised, checking whether the tin had opened and scattered her mother's cards across the mud. It hadn't. She reached out, drew it back to herself, and then she put one hand in the cold earth and pushed herself upright. She didn't look at Silas. She looked at the main house. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Granger," she said. Her voice came out steady. She hadn't been sure it would. "Mr. Granger doesn't... I'll wait." Silas blinked. It was a small thing, barely perceptible, but she caught it. He hadn't expected that. "You'll wait," he repeated. "Yes. Lady, I just put you in the mud." "I notice," she said. "I'd still like to speak with Mr. Granger." There was a beat of silence. One of the cowboys near the bunkhouse made a low sound, something between a cough and a laugh, quickly suppressed when Silas turned his head. She used that moment to straighten fully, settle the strap of her bag on her shoulder, and tuck the tin under her arm again. Her knee hurt. She didn't show that. "Stay there," Silas said, in a voice that had gone flat with something she couldn't fully read. Then he turned and went toward the main house. She stood in the yard and breathed through her nose and watched him go. The cowboys who'd seen the whole thing went back to what they were doing. Or pretended to. She was aware of being looked at. She'd been looked at most of her life, and she'd developed the particular skill of going still inside it, like an animal that knows a predator is nearby and understands that movement costs more than stillness. She studied the bunkhouse, counted the windows, looked at the chimney on the main house, and noted that the smoke coming out of it was thin and irregular, which meant whoever was managing the fire inside wasn't managing it well. 6 minutes passed. She counted them. Then the main house door opened again, and Silas came back down the steps, and behind him came a man she hadn't seen before. Tall, somewhere in his early 40s, hatless despite the cold, his hair dark and uncombed. He walked with the slightly effortful movement of a man who'd been sitting too long and hadn't slept enough, and he carried a coffee cup that he didn't seem particularly interested in drinking from. Wyatt Granger. She knew him from the way he took in the yard as he descended the steps. Not the way a guest surveys unfamiliar ground, but the way a man looks at something that's been slowly failing on his watch and he hasn't yet decided whether to fix it or mourn it. He looked at her, then at Silas, then back at her. "You're the one asking for Granger?" he said. "Yes, sir." "That's me." He stopped about 8 feet from her and drank from the cup without apparent pleasure. "Silas says you want to cook." "I do. He says you walked here from Pueblo, from Salida." He absorbed that. "That's farther." "Yes." He looked at the mud on her coat. His jaw shifted slightly. She watched him decide not to ask directly about it, which told her something about him. Not enough yet, but something. "We had a cook," he said. "He quit 4 weeks ago. Before that, we had a woman from town who lasted 10 days. Before that..." He stopped. "The point is, the position has been difficult to fill." "I understand." "Do you?" He studied her with tired eyes. 43 men, most mornings. The kitchen's a wreck. The supply situation is... He seemed to decide against completing that sentence too. "It's not an easy situation. I've worked harder," she said. "You ever cooked on a ranch this size?" "I've cooked on larger." She met his gaze. "Mr. Granger, I won't argue my qualifications with you. I'll do better than that. Let me cook one supper. Tonight. Whatever you have in the kitchen, I'll work with it. If the men don't eat better tonight than they have in the last month, I'll be gone before you wake up tomorrow. You won't even have to ask." Silas made a sound beside Granger. "Wyatt." Granger held up one hand without looking at him. He was watching Martha. Something in his expression had shifted. Not warmth, exactly. More like the thing that moves across a man's face when he unexpectedly encounters a problem he might actually be able to solve. "One supper," he said. "That's all I'm asking." He nodded, once, short. "Silas, show her the kitchen." Silas's face went the particular color of a man who has been publicly countermanded in front of an audience he was trying to impress. His eyes moved to Martha with a flat, measuring look she recognized immediately. She'd been the recipient of that look many times. It meant, "This isn't finished." She followed Silas around the side of the main house to the kitchen outbuilding, and she didn't say a word to him on the way there, and he didn't say a word to her, and when he pushed the kitchen door open and stepped back, she walked in without waiting for permission. The kitchen was a disaster. Not catastrophically, it wasn't filth exactly, more like sustained neglect. A surface-level mess that had been partially cleaned and then abandoned, repeated a dozen times. The wood stove had a residue of burned-on grease around the front burner that would take proper work to address. The flour was in the wrong container. She saw by the residue on the lid that it had been mixing with the cornmeal. There were onions going soft in a basket near the door, not spoiled yet, but close. A leg of salted pork hanging from the ceiling beam that had been allowed to dry too far. She set her tin on the cleanest section of the work table and started opening cabinets. "There's an inventory list," Silas said from the doorway. "Somewhere." "I'll manage," she said. "You need anything? There's a supply shed out back, padlocked. You'll need to ask me for the key." She turned to look at him. He smiled. It didn't reach his face particularly far. "Ranch policy," he said. "Nothing personal." She held his gaze for exactly long enough to make clear that she didn't believe him. Then she turned back to the cabinet. She heard him leave. She didn't hear him go far. The afternoon passed in the way that kitchen work always passed for Martha Bell, in a kind of methodical absorption that left very little room for anything else. She found what she was looking for. She found things she wasn't looking for but needed. She dealt with the flour situation, remedied the onions, assessed the dried pork, and made her decision about it, and got the stove drawing properly by the time the light through the small window had shifted to the flat gold of late afternoon. The biscuit tin went on the work table. She opened it with the particular care she always gave it, not reverently, nothing so dramatic as that, but attentively, the way you handle something that has carried history through enough rough travel to deserve at least that much. The recipe cards inside were her mother's handwriting, cramped, slanting script, pencil mostly, occasional ink, where her mother had felt the moment deserved permanence. The biscuit card was on top because it always wrote on top. Her mother's best conviction was that any table was welcoming if it had good biscuits on it, and Martha had never found significant evidence to the contrary. She worked. An hour later, one of the younger cowboys, she'd learned his name was Denny, 17, hired the previous spring, appeared at the kitchen door holding a bucket he seemed to have forgotten he was holding, because when the smell reached him, he stopped walking and just stood there. "That's," he started. "Buttermilk biscuits," she said, without turning around. "Go wash your hands. Supper's in 40 minutes. He went. She heard him telling someone something as he crossed the yard, but couldn't make out the words. 40 minutes later, she carried the first pan out herself. The men were already at the tables in the bunkhouse, which told her something about their expectations. They were used to waiting, used to meals arriving late and leaving something to be desired. The room had the particular silence of men who have learned not to expect much. She set the pan down and went back for the stew and the second pan of biscuits, and by the time she returned, the first pan was half gone, and 3 men were looking at each other with expressions they couldn't quite control. She served. She didn't ask for thanks. She watched the room change. It took about 10 minutes. Not dramatically. Nobody stood up and made a speech, but the quality of the silence in the room shifted. Men who had been eating with their heads down began looking up. Someone said something to the man beside him, and the man laughed. Really laughed, not the short noise men make when they're performing sociability. Young Denny ate 3 biscuits and then looked at the empty space where a 4th would have been with an expression of genuine, uncomplicated grief. An older hand named Calloway, she learned that name later too, set down his fork and sat back and looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man remembering something good. She was back in the kitchen when Granger came in. He stood in the doorway. He had his hat on now, which meant he'd been outside. His expression was difficult to read in the lamplight. She'd learned that most of his expressions were difficult to read, that it was a habit cultivated over years of not giving anything away before he was ready to. "Well," he said. She waited. "The men seem..." He paused. "I don't think I've heard that much talking in there since..." He stopped again. "Since when?" she said. He looked at her. "Since my father ran the place." She didn't say anything. He didn't seem to need her to. "There's a room off the back of this building," he said finally. "Small. Has a cot, if you want it." "Thank you," she said. He nodded. Then, before he turned to go, "What's your name?" Silas only said, "Martha Bell. Granger." He offered his hand belatedly, as if he'd remembered the convention halfway through the decision to leave. She shook it. His grip was firm and tired. "Mr. Granger," she said, "I'll need the key to the supply shed." He stopped. Silas said, "Ranch policy." I know what Silas said. He pulled a key ring from his coat pocket, removed a key from it with the practiced motion of a man who'd done it before, and held it out. "You'll need it to do your job." She took it. He left without further comment. She stood in the kitchen alone for a moment, listening to the sounds of supper carrying across the yard. Real conversation, the scrape of benches, someone laughing again, and she looked down at the key in her palm. Then she closed her fingers around it and went back to work. She was washing the last of the pans when Silas appeared in the doorway. She didn't hear him approach, which she suspected was intentional. "You did well," he said. His voice was level, easy, not unfriendly. This was, she understood immediately, more dangerous than the hostility of the afternoon. "Thank you," she said. "Don't let it go to your head." He leaned against the door frame with his arms crossed. "The men are easy to impress with a hot meal. Doesn't mean you fit here. I'm not sure I'm asking for your opinion on that." His expression didn't change. "You should be," he said quietly, "because on this ranch, my opinion is the one that runs the day-to-day. Granger handles the money and the decisions that matter. What happens between sunup and sundown, that's mine." He paused. "You'll work in this kitchen. You'll cook your meals. And anything you think you've noticed that isn't your business, you'll forget you noticed it. That's how this works." She turned to face him fully. "What would I have noticed that isn't my business?" Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled, the same smile as before, the one that didn't travel far. "Nothing yet," he said. "I'm just telling you the shape of things so you understand them before you get any ideas." She held his gaze. "I appreciate the clarity," she said. He pushed off the doorframe and left. She stood listening to his footsteps cross the yard. Then she looked at the supply shed key still in her apron pocket. Then she looked at the cabinets, specifically at the space on the lower shelf where she'd noticed, during her afternoon inventory, that 3 large sacks of flour had been logged in the supply ledger but were nowhere to be found. She'd said nothing about it. She wasn't certain yet what it meant, but she had her suspicions. And Martha Bell, who had learned patience the same way she'd learned everything else, by necessity, slowly, against resistance, understood that certainty was worth waiting for. She dried the last pan, put it on its hook, and went to bed. She lay in the small room off the back of the kitchen and listened to the wind come down off the ridge, and she thought about the ledger. She thought about the look on Calloway's face when he'd sat back from his supper. She thought about Denny staring at the empty pan. She thought about Silas's hand on her arm and the cold mud coming up to meet her knee. She wasn't the sort of woman who arrived anywhere planning to become indispensable. She'd tried that once or twice, and it hadn't served her. What she did instead was simpler. She showed up, she worked, she paid attention, and she waited for the shape of things to reveal itself. The shape of this place was revealing itself already. She blew out the lamp and closed her eyes. Outside, the wind worked at the edges of the building, looking for a way in. It didn't find one. Martha had checked the weather stripping on her way to bed. Some habits were too old to leave behind. In the main house, a lamp was still burning in Wyatt Granger's window at midnight. She could see the faint yellow line of it under her door, projected across the hard-packed ground of the yard. She wondered what he was sitting up worrying about. She had a feeling she already knew the broad answer. The specifics she'd learned soon enough. She always did. She fell asleep listening to the wind, and in the morning she was up before it, before the light, before the first rooster made its complaint from somewhere near the barn, before any of the 43 men in the bunkhouse had stirred in their blankets. The stove was drawing well. The biscuits were already mixed and resting. Whatever came next, whatever Silas Crow had planned or threatened or quietly arranged, she would meet it the same way she'd met every other hard thing, with steady hands and a hot kitchen and patience like stone. That was all she had. It had always been enough. She was already at the stove when Denny came for breakfast, and the look on his face when he smelled the kitchen from 20 feet away was worth more than anything anyone had said to her since she'd arrived. He stopped at the door the same way he had the evening before, that particular halt of a person whose body has registered something good before his mind has caught up with it. "You're all ready," he started. "Sit down," she said. "Coffee's on the side table. Don't touch the biscuits yet. They need 2 more minutes." He sat. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and hunched over it like a man protecting something valuable from the wind. And she watched him in her peripheral vision and thought, 17, homesick, hasn't said so to anyone. She recognized that particular posture from kitchens past. Boys who'd come west with ideas about themselves and found the reality considerably harder. "You been here long?" she asked. "Since April," he said. "Family back east?" He looked up. "Kansas. Why?" "No reason." She turned the biscuits. "You eat breakfast before you came west, or did they not feed you there either?" He made a sound, not quite a laugh, but moving in that direction. "My mama cooked pretty good," he said. Then, more quietly, "She made these same biscuits. Near enough." Martha didn't say anything to that. She put a plate in front of him and went back to the stove, and she heard him go still for a moment before he started eating. The rest of the men came in over the next 20 minutes. Not all at once. They arrived in the scattered, slightly defensive way of people who have learned that good things don't stay good, and it's better to approach carefully. But they came. By By 7 o'clock, the bunkhouse table was full, and the noise level was something Martha hadn't heard in the building yet. Not just the sound of eating, but of actual exchange. One man asking another a question and getting a real answer. Two older hands arguing about fence repair with the comfortable heat of people who've had the same argument before and don't mind having it again. She worked the kitchen and didn't insert herself into any of it. That wasn't her role, and she knew it. Her role was the food, and through the food, everything the food carried. Silas did not come to breakfast. She noticed his absence and filed it without reacting to it. Calloway, she'd learned his full name the night before from Denny, who'd supplied information about the ranch's social hierarchy with the unself-conscious thoroughness of a boy who doesn't know he's being informative, came to the kitchen window after the meal while she was washing up. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, the kind of man whose face had been worked on by weather and time until it resembled terrain more than skin. He stood with his hat in his hands, which she took as a reasonable sign. "That was a good breakfast, ma'am," he said. "Thank you." He stopped, worked the hat brim between his fingers. It was a good breakfast. We haven't had a real breakfast in a while." "How long is a while?" He looked past her shoulder, calculating. Chet quit in October. Before that, we had a rotation. Whoever was least useful that week cooked, which meant nobody cooked. What happened to Chet? Calloway's expression shifted slightly, the way a man's expression shifts when he's decided how much to say. Chet had disagreements with the foreman, he said carefully, about how things were being run. She rinsed a pan and set it to drain. What kind of disagreements? The kind that end with a man deciding he'd rather find work elsewhere. He put his hat back on. "I'm not telling you that to scare you off. I'm telling you because you seem like you pay attention." "I try to." He nodded. "Granger's a good man," he said, and there was something deliberate in the way he said it. Not a statement about the present so much as a defense of something he was worried about losing. "He's had a hard couple of years, lost his father 2 years back. Ranch has been..." He stopped. "He's a good man who's been too busy keeping the whole thing from falling apart to notice some of what's falling apart." She looked at him directly. "The supply shortages." His eyes steadied on her face. "Denny talks too much," he said. "Denny didn't say a word," she said. "I looked at the ledger." A pause. Calloway studied her with a new quality of attention. Then he nodded. Once, short. The same nod Granger had given her the night before, and she filed away the resemblance between the two men's gestures. Sometimes ranches had their own language. "You be careful," he said. "That's all I'm saying." He left. She finished the dishes and went to examine the ledger more carefully. She brought it to the kitchen table and laid it flat and went through it page by page with the same systematic attention she brought to any inventory. The records went back 14 months. For the first 4 months, they were clean. Straightforward entries in a careful hand she didn't recognize, someone who'd kept records before and understood why they mattered. Then the handwriting changed. The new entries were in a looser, more careless script, and they were also, when you looked carefully, inconsistent in ways that a person not paying close attention would miss entirely. Quantities logged received that didn't match quantities logged used. Gaps in the dates that were small enough to be explained as oversight and numerous enough that oversight wasn't the right explanation. A pattern of losses blamed on spoilage, flour, salt pork, dried beans, cornmeal, that followed no seasonal logic whatsoever. She sat with the ledger for an hour, then she closed it and sat with what she knew. She was still sitting there when the kitchen door opened and Wyatt Granger stepped in. He stopped when he saw her at the table with the closed ledger in front of her, and something moved across his face before he controlled it. "Morning," he said. "Good morning." She didn't move the ledger. He looked at it, then at her. "Going through the accounts?" "I needed to understand what supplies we actually have," she said, "versus what's on record." He came the rest of the way into the kitchen and poured himself coffee from the pot she'd left on the stove. His movements were deliberate, and she had the sense he was using them to buy time. "And," he said, "there are some inconsistencies." He turned around with the cup. His face was careful. "What kind?" "The kind worth looking at more carefully." She paused. "I don't want to tell you something is certain when I haven't finished being sure of it, but I think you should know I've noticed." He was quiet for a moment. He drank his coffee. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the ranch starting its morning. Horses, the distant clang of something metal being moved in the barn, voices. "Silas manages the supply records," he said. His voice was very level. "I know. He's been with this ranch for 9 years. I know that too." She met his eyes. I'm not asking you to do anything about it. I'm telling you that I noticed because I think you should have noticed and I'm not certain you have. Something flickered in his face. Not anger, but something adjacent to it, or maybe adjacent to the shame that was adjacent to it. He turned back to the window. What do you need from the supply shed? He said. His voice had gone to the flat tone of a man redirecting. Cornmeal, more salt. If there's any dried apple left, I'd like it. I'll tell Silas to... I have the key, she said. He turned back. You gave it to me, she said. He looked at her for a moment, then he nodded. Right, he said. Right, I did. He left the kitchen without finishing his coffee. She watched him cross the yard toward the barn, his stride carrying that particular quality she'd noticed in him. Purposeful from a distance, effortful up close. A man who was working harder than he should have to at appearing to be in control. She went to the supply shed and took inventory of what was actually there. The differences were not enormous in any single category. That was how it worked. She understood that instinctively. You didn't take so much from one place that the absence was obvious. You spread it thin. Flour here, beans there, the salt pork that appeared in the ledger and had not appeared on the shelf when she arrived. Small enough that any individual cook, harried enough and working fast enough, wouldn't notice or wouldn't be sure enough of what they were seeing to say anything. Accumulated over 14 months, it wasn't small. She did the arithmetic in her head, which she was good at. She'd been good at it since her mother had started teaching her how to run a household budget at the age of 9, in the particular urgent way of women who understand that knowing where the money goes is a form of survival. The number she arrived at was significant. She returned to the kitchen and wrote nothing down. Not yet. Writing it down was a decision about what came next, and she hadn't made that decision. The morning passed. She prepped for the midday meal. 3 of the ranch hands drifted past the kitchen window at different points during the morning. Not for any particular reason, she suspected, just because the kitchen had become a kind of landmark. The smell of something real and ongoing in a place that had been going without. 2 of them she didn't recognize yet. The third was a young man named Hector, who'd worked the ranch for 4 years and had the worn-down quality of someone who'd been doing good work in a place that had stopped seeing it. He appeared at the window while she was chopping onions and said, with the slightly strangled care of a man who isn't used to complimenting people, "Those biscuits last night were real good." "Thank you, Hector." He looked startled that she knew his name. "You know who I am?" "I'm learning," she said. "You've been here 4 years. You handle the north fence line." "How do you—" He stopped. "Denny. Denny's informative," she said. "You have a blister on your right hand that you've been ignoring. There's a tin of salve on the window shelf. Take it." He looked at the shelf, at the tin, back at her. I noticed this morning at breakfast. It's going to split if you don't treat it, and a split blister in this cold is going to put you out of work for 3 days. The salve's not complicated. Just use it." He took the tin with the slightly dazed expression of a man who has not had someone look out for him in long enough that the experience has become disorienting. She went back to her onions. She heard him at the window a minute later. "Thank you, ma'am." "Martha," she said. "You don't have to call me ma'am." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and she heard him walk away, and she found, despite everything, that she was smiling. That was how it started. Not dramatically, not with any single gesture or declaration. But over the following week, something shifted in the daily texture of Ironwood Ridge Ranch, and it shifted from the kitchen outward the way warmth moves through a cold building, slowly, unevenly, through whatever passages it can find. She stocked the windowsill with basic things: salve, clean cloth for bandages, a tin of the drawing paste her mother had sworn by for splinters and infected cuts. She said nothing about it to anyone. The men found it themselves. They used it the way people use things that appear without announcement, quietly, slightly guiltily, the way you accept help when you haven't decided yet whether you deserve it. She started learning names systematically. 43 men. She had them all in 10 days, along with enough particulars to make the name meaningful. Not a roster, but a person attached to each one. Calloway's bad shoulder that he'd torqued in a fall 3 years back and hadn't had set properly. A hand named Pete who went quiet at meals on Sundays with a regularity that suggested he was doing the same arithmetic in his head every Sunday. A pair of brothers, Amos and Dutch, who communicated in a clipped half-language of their own and were generally excellent and generally overlooked. She noticed what they ate slowly and what they finished fast. She adjusted. She noticed which men had been assigned to which tasks and where the assignments didn't match the men's actual capacities. She said nothing about that. Not yet, it wasn't her place, but she filed it. What she didn't file was Silas. She watched him. He was good at his job. She had to acknowledge that. In the operational sense, he knew the ranch and he managed its rhythms with the efficiency of long practice. He knew which horses needed rest and which pastures were overgrazed and how to read the weather coming off the mountain with a reliability that Granger clearly depended on. He ran the hands with a firm hand that didn't tip all the way into cruelty. Stayed just on the acceptable side of it. The men didn't like him, but they didn't complain in any way that would stick. What Silas was also good at was watching her. She felt it in the way she felt any consistent attention, as a slight change in the air around her movements. He didn't hover. He didn't make any further comments about her appearance or her qualifications. He was scrupulously, pointedly, professionally polite whenever their paths crossed in front of other people. But he was watching her, and she was watching him watch her. On the 8th day, she found the kitchen lock changed. She arrived before dawn as usual and put her hand on the door and found a new padlock where the old latch had been. She stood there for a moment with her hand still on it, feeling the cold brass under her palm, then turned and went to the main house and knocked on the door. Granger answered in his shirt and no vest, hair still disordered from sleep. He looked at her. Then at the hour, then at her expression. "What happened?" he said. Not a question. Someone changed the kitchen lock. His jaw set. She watched the tiredness in his face consolidate into something harder. "I'll get a key," he said. "It's your kitchen," she said. "I only need access." He was back in 4 minutes with a key cut for the new lock. He didn't say where he'd gotten it. She didn't ask. "You know who did it," she said. "I have an idea. Are you going to address it?" He looked at her. His face was doing the thing she'd come to recognize, the careful arrangement of a man managing more information than he was prepared to act on. "I'll address it," he said. She nodded. "The men are going to be hungry in an hour and a half. I need to start the stove." He stepped aside. She went to the kitchen and lit the stove and started her morning and didn't hear what passed between Granger and Silas that day. But whatever it was, the kitchen lock was back to its original latch by noon, and Silas wore an expression at the midday meal that she read without difficulty. He hadn't expected her to go directly to Granger. He'd expected her to fume or complain to the other hands or simply accept the obstacle. He'd read her wrong and he knew it now, and that made him more dangerous than before in a specific way. It made him attentive in a different register. She stayed careful. She stayed useful. The meals continued, better, week by week, not from any dramatic improvement in supplies, but from the ordinary accumulation of her understanding of what she had to work with and what the men needed. She found ways to make the dried beans interesting. She got the salted pork to a point where 3 of the older hands told her it was the best they'd had since coming west, which she suspected was somewhat exaggerated but accepted graciously because the sentiment behind it was real. Granger started eating in the kitchen some evenings. Not every evening, but often enough that it became, without either of them acknowledging it, a kind of pattern. He would come in after the main meal was done and she was cleaning up, and he would sit at the kitchen table with whatever was left in the pot, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they didn't. The talking was about practical things, supplies, scheduling, what the men needed, but practical conversation in a small room over a late meal has a way of eventually becoming something else, if neither person leaves before it does. She learned that his father had built Ironwood Ridge from a single parcel. She learned that Wyatt had come back to it at 28 after years trying to make something of himself elsewhere and had felt, when he walked back through the gate, something he wasn't sure whether to call defeat or return. She learned that he hadn't been sleeping well for months, that the ranch's debt situation was worse than he'd let on to anyone, and that he was aware, in the way that intelligent people are sometimes aware of things they aren't willing to look at directly, that the numbers Silas gave him about the ranch's operating costs didn't add up the way they should. He didn't say that last part outright, but he came close enough that she understood. She didn't press. She'd learned that some things had to be arrived at in a man's own time, especially if the thing was an admission that he'd been trusting someone he shouldn't have trusted. 3 weeks in, Silas did something that was either careless or calculated, and she spent the following day trying to determine which. He announced at the morning meal, loudly in front of 12 ranch hands, that the ranch was reducing the food budget by 1/3 because of wasteful cooking practices, and that the cook would need to submit a proposed menu for Granger's approval before preparing any meal. The table went quiet. She was at the stove when he said it. She didn't turn around. Calloway said, carefully, "Silas, Granger approved." "I'm conveying Granger's decision," Silas said. She turned then. She looked at Silas across the room. His expression was pleasant and entirely impenetrable. "I'll speak with Mr. Granger," she said. "You're welcome to?" She found Granger in the barn. "Did you instruct Silas to reduce the food budget?" she asked. He turned. The look on his face told her the answer before he spoke. "No," he said. "Did you ask him to implement menu approval?" "No." His voice had gone flat. "Where did you hear?" He announced it at breakfast, in front of the men. Granger was quiet for a moment. His jaw had tightened. "I'll talk to him." "That's the third time you've said that." She kept her voice even. "I'm not trying to create a conflict between you and your foreman. I'm trying to do my job, and I need to understand who I actually answer to." He looked at her. The question landed between them, and neither of them looked away from it. "You answer to me," he said. "Then I need that to mean something," she said. "Not just when I bring you evidence of a problem. Day to day." He was quiet. She watched him work through it, the particular difficulty of a man who has been managing everything alone for so long that acknowledging a structural problem feels like acknowledging personal failure. "I'll handle it," he said finally, "properly this time." She held his gaze for a moment. "All right," she said. Then she went back to the kitchen. She was halfway through prepping the midday meal when she heard through the barn wall the sound of two men in conversation that was not quite an argument and not quite not one. She couldn't make out the words. She didn't try. She kept her hands moving. Denny appeared at the kitchen window an hour later with a split knuckle and the sheepish expression of someone who has hurt himself doing something obvious. "I put my hand wrong on the post," he said. She got the cloth and the salve without comment, and he held out his hand across the windowsill and she worked on it, while he watched her with the expression she'd been seeing more often on the younger ranch hands, something between gratitude and the kind of confused trust a person develops when they haven't had much reason to trust and someone gives them reason anyway. "Is Silas in trouble?" he asked. "That's not my business to know," she said. "He's been in a mood all morning. Men in moods are Granger's concern." She tied off the cloth. "Keep it clean and dry for 2 days." "Yes, ma'am. Martha." He corrected himself with the automatic quality of someone who'd been practicing. She'd been asking them to call her Martha for 3 weeks, and they were getting there gradually, the younger ones faster than the older ones. "Thank you," he said. "Go put the post in right this time," she said. He grinned, a real grin, the unguarded kind, and pushed off the window and jogged back across the yard, and she watched him go and felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but lived in the same neighborhood. That evening, Calloway came to the kitchen with his hat in his hands again. He didn't have an excuse this time. He just stood in the doorway and looked at her cleaning up and then said, without any particular preamble, "You changed something here." She kept wiping the table. "I make biscuits." "You know what I mean?" She did. She stopped wiping and looked at him. "The men are different," he said. "They were..." He stopped, started again. "When Chet left and before that, when things started going wrong, men here were quiet. Not peaceful quiet, the other kind. The kind where everybody's keeping their head down because keeping your head down feels safer than noticing what's wrong." He shifted his hat. "That's gone. In 3 weeks, that's mostly gone." She sat down at the table. "Calloway, I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer me straight." "I'll try. How long has Silas been taking from the supplies?" The silence that followed was the silence of a man who has been carrying something heavy and has been waiting, without admitting it to himself, for someone to ask. "Since about a year after Granger's father died," he said. She nodded. "I don't have proof," he said. "Nothing I could put in front of anyone." "I do," she said. "I have the ledger." He looked at her. His face went through several things in quick succession, and what settled on it at the end was something tired and relieved and apprehensive all at once. "What are you going to do with it?" he said. She folded her hands on the table. "I'm still thinking about how," she said. "The what is already decided." He put his hat back on. At the door, he stopped. "He'll fight it," he said. "Whatever you do, he'll fight it." "I imagine," she said. "He's got connections in town. The sheriff's a friend of his." "Good to know." He looked at her for a moment. "You're not frightened," he said. Not an accusation, more like something he was trying to understand. "I'm frightened," she said. "I'm just not going to let it make the decision for me." Calloway was quiet. Then he gave a single nod. One of those nods that contains more than a nod usually holds. "Good night, Martha," he said. "Good night." She sat at the table alone after he left, the cleaned kitchen around her, the stove cooling, the wind picking up outside with the particular rising note that meant weather building somewhere in the mountains. She thought about the ledger. She thought about Silas's expression when Granger had countermanded him about the kitchen key. She thought about the 14 months of careful, patient, small-scale theft she'd laid out in her head in a number that Granger didn't yet know. She thought about her mother's biscuit tin sitting on the shelf, battered and present. She hadn't planned to care about this ranch. She hadn't planned to care about any of these men with their cracked hands and their quiet griefs and their suppressed capacity for laughter that she'd been watching come back to the surface, meal by meal, week by week, like something that had been buried and was finding its way to air again. But she did care. That was the problem, or maybe it was the point. She got up and checked the stove and put out the lamp. In the bunkhouse, someone was playing a harmonica. Badly, cheerfully, without much concern for the quality of the sound. She stood in the dark doorway of the kitchen for a moment and listened. 3 weeks ago, that building had been silent by 8 o'clock. A particular kind of silence that had weight to it. The weight of men who'd stopped expecting the day to offer them anything worth talking about afterward. She went to bed. The harmonica kept going for another half hour, tuneless and happy, and she lay in the dark and listened to it until she fell asleep. She was going to need to be very careful about what came next. She was also going to do it anyway. The weather came down off the ridge on a Thursday. Martha felt it before she saw it. A change in the air pressure that she'd learned to read in kitchens near mountains, the particular heaviness that settled in behind the ears and made the stove draw differently. She'd been watching the sky for 2 days, noting how the clouds stacked up against the peaks to the northwest and didn't move the way normal clouds moved. They built. Patient and indifferent. She started making changes to her stores on Wednesday evening without telling anyone why. She moved the dried beans from the lower shelf to the higher one. She brought extra wood into the kitchen and stacked it against the inside wall until Denny, passing by, asked her why she was doing that, and she said, "Because we're going to need it." And he looked at the sky and then back at her and went and got another armload without being asked. That was Denny. He'd learned, in the weeks since her arrival, that when Martha Bell moved with purpose, the correct response was to assist rather than question. By Wednesday night, she tripled the kitchen's interior wood supply, moved every perishable she could off the floor, and filled every large pot and vessel she owned with water from the well, because she knew from experience that the pump handle froze before anything else did, and a kitchen without water was a kitchen that couldn't function when it was needed most. She was rechecking the stove joints for draft gaps when Granger appeared in the kitchen doorway at close to 10 o'clock. He looked at the stacked wood and the rows of filled vessels and the deliberate reorganization of the shelves, and then he looked at her. "Storm?" he said. "Bad one," she said. "Tomorrow night or the night after. Not a regular snow." The hands aren't reading it right. She tightened the joint fitting. "It's going to be a sustained blow. 2 days minimum, possibly 3. He was quiet for a moment. "I should move the cattle down from the north pasture. I'd start at dawn." He stayed in the doorway looking at the kitchen, and she had the sense he was taking inventory of it the way she took inventory of everything, categorically, honestly, without looking away from the less favorable items. "Silas thinks it'll pass north of us," he said. "Silas is wrong." She said it without any particular heat, not as a challenge, just as a statement of what she'd determined from the evidence. Granger received it the same way. "I'll start moving cattle in the morning," he said. He left. She heard him cross the yard toward the bunkhouse, and then the sound of his voice carrying orders in the cold dark, and then the sound of men getting up and beginning to prepare. She went back to the stove joints. The storm arrived not Thursday night, but Thursday midday, which was earlier than she'd estimated and later than she'd feared, and it arrived with the particular seriousness of a thing that has been traveling a long distance and has not tired itself out in the doing. The temperature dropped 12 degrees in 2 hours. The wind found every gap in every structure and made its presence known in each one. Martha was already running 3 things simultaneously when the first men came back inside. The stove was at full capacity, both burners going, the oven section converted to a secondary heat source, with the door propped open an inch the way her mother had taught her, which was wasteful in normal circumstances and practical in extreme ones. She had a large pot of stew working, a second pot of water already heated for whatever came in from outside. The bread she'd been planning to bake that morning had been converted instead to a dense pan bread that cooked faster and held heat longer. She'd made that decision at 11 o'clock when the temperature started dropping with unusual speed. Calloway was the first back. He came through the kitchen door, not the bunkhouse, which told her something about where everyone was going to end up, with snow already layered on the shoulders of his coat, and his face carrying the contained expression of a man who has been through hard weather before and is not surprised to be in it again. "North fence line crews coming in," he said. 4 men. Hector's not with them." She turned from the stove. "Where's Hector?" "Last anyone saw him, he was checking the far end of the line. That was 2 hours ago." She looked at Calloway's face. He looked at hers. Neither of them said the thing they were both thinking. Granger know? She said. Going to tell him now. Tell him in here. I need to know what's happening. He went. She added more fuel to the stove and moved the stew back half an inch from the heat to keep it from scorching while she turned her attention to the other problem, which was that 4 men were coming in from sustained cold exposure and would need to warm from the outside in, which meant she needed hot liquid and she needed it immediate, not in 20 minutes. She had the coffee already brewed and a second pot of something stronger and more caloric, a grain drink thickened with rendered fat, which was practical rather than pleasant, on the secondary burner by the time the North Fence crew came through the door. She handed each man a cup in sequence, assessed their color and movement as they drank, noted that 2 of them were fine. One was moving stiffly in a way that would need watching, and one, a young man named Terrence, 19, who hadn't been at Ironwood Ridge long enough to have developed the appropriate respect for mountain weather, had the pale, slightly vague expression that preceded real trouble. Terrence, she said, sit here. She pointed to the chair closest to the open oven. Take your boots off. I'm fine, he said. Your boots. Off. He sat and worked his boots off with fingers that weren't cooperating properly, and she crouched and looked at his feet and said nothing out loud about what she saw, but stood up and got the basin of warm, not hot, warm, water that she'd prepared without quite knowing yet that she'd need it specifically for this purpose, and set it on the floor in front of him. Put your feet in. Don't move them around. Just let them sit. It's not that bad, he said, with the defensive assurance of a person who has no reliable method currently of judging how bad it is. You're right, she said. Keep your feet in the basin. Granger came in with Calloway behind him. He looked at Terrence, then at the basin, then at Martha. His expression tightened. Where would Hector go if he was caught out? She asked him. There's a line shack at the far end of the North Fence, he said. 1/4 mile past where we can see from here in this weather. Can you get to it? Maybe. He said it honestly, which she respected. Maybe not. He's been there 2 hours already. I know. He turned to Calloway. Get Dutch and Amos. Tell them what we're doing. Wyatt, Calloway started. Now. Calloway went. Granger looked at Martha. Keep the door clear, he said. We may need to carry him in. I'll be ready, she said. He pulled his hat down and went back out into the storm. She turned back to Terrence and checked his color, which had improved slightly, and the stiffness in the man to her right who'd been moving wrong, and the overall status of the kitchen, which was warm enough to be genuinely useful and stocked enough to sustain it for at least 24 hours under current conditions. She ran the calculation in her head. 24 hours was enough if the storm did what storms usually did. If it didn't, she'd run the calculation again. The next 4 hours were the longest she'd spent in any kitchen. Men came and went. Mostly came. The bunkhouse, it turned out, was losing heat faster than expected because someone had not properly banked the exterior wall on the north side the previous autumn, which was a maintenance failure she filed and would address later, and so the kitchen became by necessity the central gathering point for men who needed warmth and had nowhere better to find it. She ran the stove hard and kept food moving. Not elaborate food, not the meals she preferred to make, but functional food. Dense, caloric, hot. Bread and fat and salt and heat, which was what bodies needed when they were fighting cold. She organized without appearing to organize. She set the older, less mobile men near the stove and the younger ones farther out where there was more room to move. She kept a clear path from the door to the center of the room because she didn't know yet whether they'd be carrying someone through it, and she wanted that decision already made. She kept Terrence in the chair and checked his feet every 30 minutes and updated her assessment each time. And by the 3rd check, she had decided he was going to be all right and allowed herself to stop thinking about him as an emergency. It was during the 2nd hour that she found the ruined stores. She went to the lower shelves for the 2nd sack of cornmeal and found it wet. Not from the storm. The kitchen hadn't taken any water. Wet in the specific way of something that has had water introduced to it deliberately. The sack was heavy and sodden, and the meal inside was already beginning to clump into the useless paste that meant it was gone. She pulled the sack out, checked the one behind it, also wet. She stood very still for a moment in the lamplight, holding the ruined sack in both hands. Then she put it down and checked the flour. The first container was fine. The second, behind it, in the back of the lower cabinet where she'd put the overflow, was wet. Not as bad as the cornmeal. Bad enough. She stood in the kitchen with the sounds of the storm and the men around her, and she understood, with a clarity that was very cold and very calm, what had happened. Silas had been in the kitchen the night before. She hadn't seen him, but she'd smelled the particular hair tallow he used and had assumed he was walking past. He hadn't walked past. She had approximately 2/3 of the food she'd thought she had, maybe slightly less. She went back to the stove and stood with her hands flat on the work surface and thought about it plainly. 20 or more men. A storm that was going to last at least another 36 hours based on current conditions. 2/3 of anticipated supplies. The problem was solvable. It required flexibility, and it required letting go of what she'd planned to serve and accepting what she could actually make, which was a version of the same discipline she'd been practicing her whole working life. You cooked with what you had. You always had something to work with. The question was whether you were willing to be creative enough to find it. She started working. By the time Granger came back through the door, 4.5 hours after he'd left, carrying one side of Hector, Dutch carrying the other, the kitchen smelled different than it had before. Not worse, different. What she'd made from the remaining supplies had a quality she hadn't intended when she'd planned the day's meals and didn't quite have a name for. Something stripped down and direct. The men who'd been sitting in the kitchen for hours had been eating it steadily and without complaint, and the bowls were going back empty. She saw Hector's face when they brought him in, and her stomach dropped. He was conscious. That was the first thing and the most important thing. Conscious but barely present. His eyes were open and tracking but slowly. The particular slow tracking of a man whose body has spent several hours in a negotiation with the cold and has not fully determined who won. His hands were the color she didn't want to see. "Here," she said, and she already had the basin prepared, already had the chair positioned, and she didn't move anyone out of the way. She simply began, and the men made room because they'd been watching her work for 4 hours and had learned that when she moved with that quality of purpose, the correct response was to clear the path. She worked on Hector for 40 minutes. Wyatt stayed. He sat on the bench against the wall and watched, and she was aware of him watching, but it didn't affect her hands. Hector's color improved. Slowly, unevenly, the specific slow return of warmth to a body that had been genuinely cold rather than merely uncomfortable. He started talking somewhere around the 20-minute mark, which she took as a good sign, even though what he said didn't make complete sense. "Tell Rosaria," he said. "I'll tell her," Martha said. She didn't know who Rosaria was. She'd find out. "The horse is, the fence on the east side is..." "We'll fix the fence," she said. "Drink this." She held the cup to his mouth and he drank, and his hands, when she checked them again, were better than before. Wyatt came to stand beside her at some point during the 3rd hour of the storm's worst intensity. The kitchen was full. 14 men, which was more than the space was designed for, but warmth doesn't argue with geometry. And the noise level was the noise of people enduring together rather than separately, which is a different kind of noise than either silence or celebration. "He's going to be all right," she said, before Granger asked. "I know," he said. "I can see that." He was quiet for a moment. "You knew. Yesterday." "About the storm?" "You had the kitchen prepared, the water, the wood. I've been in bad weather before. Most people looked at that sky and saw regular snow." She looked at him sideways. Most people weren't paying attention. He was quiet again. Around them, the kitchen moved in the way she'd organized it. Men cycling between the warmth near the stove and the somewhat cooler space near the door. Food moving from the pots to the bowls and back again in the steady rhythm she'd set up. It wasn't orderly in the pretty sense. It was functional in the real sense, which was the only kind that mattered. "The supplies are short," she said. She said it quietly, under the general noise. His face did the careful thing. "Shorter than they should be," she said. "I found wet sacks this evening, cornmeal and flour. Someone introduced water to them yesterday or the night before." She felt him go still beside her. "I'm telling you now," she said, "because I don't want you to be surprised when I tell you we're managing on 2/3 of what I'd planned, and also because what happened to those stores wasn't an accident and you deserve to know that." "Silas." She didn't answer that directly. "I don't have proof it was Silas specifically, the way I have proof about the ledger. I have circumstantial evidence and a reasonable conclusion." "The ledger?" He said it the way a man says a thing he's been not saying for a while. "Yes." "You still have it. I have the relevant pages. I documented the discrepancies." She checked on Terrence automatically, without pausing in the conversation, feet, color, alertness, and found him improved enough to stop worrying. It's enough to take to someone with authority over the ranch's financial records, a lawyer or a county official with jurisdiction. Granger looked at Hector, who had fallen into actual sleep now, the good kind, the functional kind. "I should have seen it," he said. "Very quiet, just for her." "You are managing a ranch by yourself," she said. In debt, short-handed after losing your father. That's not an excuse. No, she agreed, but it's a reason. There's a difference. He looked at her. The lamp was burning low, and she hadn't gotten up to adjust it yet, and in the diminished light, his face was harder to read than usual, which meant what she saw was probably closer to what was actually there. How are you doing this? He said. Doing what? All of it. He made a gesture that took in the kitchen, the men, the running stove, the organized warmth. You've been here 5 weeks. I cook, she said. That's what I do. That's not what I mean. She understood what he meant. She chose not to say so, because there were things that benefited from being left slightly unsaid. And the two of them, standing in the middle of a storm with 14 cold men around them and a recovered almost emergency behind them, was not the right moment to say them. Go check on your cattle, she said instead. He almost smiled. The cattle are fine. Then check on them again. I need to move around in here and you're in the way. He moved. He even almost smiled doing it. She went back to work. The storm peaked around midnight and began its slow recession somewhere before dawn. She could tell by the change in the wind, the gusting quality giving way to a steadier push, the rattling of the kitchen walls settling into a lower, more consistent pressure. She'd been awake for 21 hours at that point, which wasn't a record for her, but was getting close. She was doing the last round of the kitchen, checking stores, banking the stove, making sure every man who'd been in the room had eaten and been checked, when she found Silas. He was in the doorway she hadn't been watching, the one that connected the kitchen to the supply passage. He'd been standing there quietly, she didn't know how long. And when she turned and found him, she felt the cold spike of surprise move through her and then settle. He was looking at the kitchen. The organized, functioning, surviving kitchen with its rows of eaten bowls and its warm stove and its sleeping men. You managed, he said. Yes, she said, despite the shortage. His voice was level, unhurried, the voice of a man who has prepared for this moment. Yes. Interesting, he said, almost like you'd planned for something to go wrong. She held his gaze. Almost. Something moved in his eyes. Not guilt. She hadn't expected guilt. Something colder than guilt. Calculation. You've been talking to Granger, he said. He's my employer. About the ledger. She said nothing. I know you have it, he said. Or copies of it. Granger came to me yesterday with questions he wouldn't have known to ask without someone telling him what to look for. He paused. I've been on this ranch 9 years. I know where every dollar came from and where every dollar went, and I know things about this operation that you could never learn in 5 weeks. I'm sure that's true, she said. Whatever you think you found. I know what I found, she said. I'm not confused about it. He studied her. She stayed perfectly still. You're making an enemy, he said, of someone who was here before you and will be here after you. Maybe, she said, or maybe the opposite. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and went back into the supply passage, and she heard his footsteps move away toward the back of the building. She stood in the quiet kitchen and breathed. Then she checked the stove, adjusted the damper, and went to the work table where she'd set a small covered dish aside 3 hours earlier. She looked in on Hector. He was sleeping with his hands curled against his chest, color good, breathing even. She covered him with the extra blanket from the shelf. Terrence, in the chair near the stove, had been properly asleep for 2 hours. Denny was on the bench along the wall, hat pulled over his face. Calloway was awake. He'd been awake most of the night, she suspected, which was something she'd noted about him. He slept light and woke at sounds and had the general vigilance of a man who'd appointed himself responsible for noticing things that other people missed. He looked at her from the bench. His eyes moved to the supply passage doorway, then back. I heard, he said quietly. She sat down at the kitchen table. Her feet hurt. She hadn't sat down in 8 hours, and the acknowledgement of it moved through her body like a slow wave. How bad is the passage between here and Granger knowing everything he needs to know, she said. Calloway considered it. Silas is going to move fast. If he thinks you've got real documentation, he won't wait for you to go first. What does moving fast look like for him? Could be a lot of things. He's got the sheriff's ear. I told you that. He's got friends in town who have lent this ranch money at various points. Men who'd rather have the debt called than see Silas go down. He paused. Or he could just make the documentation disappear. She looked at him. Where do you think I'm keeping it? Calloway's mouth moved slightly. I think you're not keeping it anywhere Silas could easily get to it. I think you're right, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. You sent something to someone, he said. Not a question. 3 weeks ago, she said. When I was sure. There's a man in Denver, an attorney who handles land and property disputes. He has copies of the relevant pages sent by post. She paused. I asked Denny to take them to the post office in town the morning after our conversation in the kitchen. Denny doesn't know what he carried. Calloway was quiet for a while. Outside, the wind continued its slow retreat, pulling back from the ridgeline like something that had overstayed. You planned that far ahead, he said. I plan, she said. It's what I do. He looked at the kitchen, the whole of it, the sleeping men and the warm stove and the organized shelves and the storm retreating outside. Yeah, he said. I'm starting to see that. She got up and adjusted the stove damper and put the last of the bread where it would stay warm until morning, and then she sat back down, because there was nothing else she could do right now, and her body had opinions about standing that it was becoming difficult to argue with. In the chair near the stove, Hector's hands, curled against his chest, were the right color now. Normal. Living. She looked at them for a while. She was frightened. She'd said that to Calloway weeks ago, and it remained true. Silas was not a foolish man, and he was not a slow one, and the fact that she'd moved before he was ready didn't mean he wouldn't move now. The attorney in Denver was a protection, not a guarantee. Nothing she had was a guarantee. But the kitchen was warm. The men were fed. Hector's hands were the right color. Terrence was going to keep his feet. She'd managed. Despite the shortage, as Silas had said, with his particular flat smile. She had. And she'd do it again tomorrow, and however many days after that it took for the shape of this thing to fully reveal itself and for everyone involved to understand what she'd built here and what she intended to protect. She put her head down on her folded arms at the kitchen table, just for a minute, just to rest her eyes, and was asleep before she'd finished the thought. She woke with her cheek on her folded arms and the kitchen already light. For a moment she didn't know where she was. Then the stove smell reached her. Banked coals, the particular dry warmth of a kitchen that has been running hard and is resting. And she remembered all of it in the fast, ungentle way that things come back after you've slept too few hours. She lifted her head. Denny was at the stove. He'd added wood without being asked and had the coffee on and was standing with his back to her in the particular careful way of a person who is trying not to wake someone up while also being in the same room with them. What time? She said. He turned. Just past 6. He kept his voice low. Calloway said to let you sleep. She looked at the room. Terrence was gone, his chair empty, the blanket folded with more care than she'd have expected from a 19-year-old. Hector was still on the bench, awake, watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. How do you feel? She said to Hector. Like I slept on a bench, he said. Your hands. He looked at them, opened and closed them slowly. Stiff. Better than last night. Can you move all your fingers? He demonstrated. She assessed. You'll lose some feeling in the tips for a while, she said. Could be weeks. Don't rush it, and don't put them near anything very hot until the sensation is reliable. She paused. Who's Rosaria? His face changed. My sister, in Pueblo. He was quiet for a moment. I was talking. A little. I was going to write her, he said. I've been meaning to. I kept putting it off. He looked at his hands. That's a stupid thing to put off. Yes, she said. Write her today. She stood up, her back made its opinion known, and she ignored it. She took the coffee Denny offered without comment and drank it standing at the work table and began the process of assessing what she had left after the storm and what the day needed. Outside, the storm was gone. The world through the small kitchen window was the blinding white and hard blue that follows a significant snow. Everything sharp-edged and unfamiliar, the familiar shapes of the ranch buried or altered enough to look like a different place. She could see 3 of the hands already moving in the yard, shoveling a path between the bunkhouse and the barn. Their breath came up in clouds. The ranch was still standing. That was the first calculation. She was in the middle of the second. What she had left in stores, what she needed to get from the supply shed, how many men she was feeding, and for how many meals before the road to town became passable. When Granger came through the door, he was dressed for outside, coat and hat, boots already wet from the snow. He stopped when he saw her awake and something moved across his face that she didn't examine too closely. You slept here, he said. I did. Calloway said you were up until... When did you sleep? Sometime after 2. She wasn't entirely sure. I'm fine. He looked like he had several things he wanted to say about that assessment and had decided not to say any of them. The cattle are okay. We lost 2 head up on the north slope, but the rest came through. The barn's intact. He pulled his hat off and ran a hand over his hair. The north bunkhouse wall needs work, the one that was losing heat. Amos found ice forming on the inside. That needs to be fixed before the next storm. I know. I'm putting Dutch and Amos on it today. He stopped. She could tell by his posture that there was something else, something that had followed him through the door after the practical. What? She said. Silas is gone. She set down the coffee cup. When I went to find him this morning, I wanted to talk to him. I decided last night I was going to talk to him today and not wait any longer. His room in the bunkhouse was cleared out. He took his horse. Granger's face was doing the careful thing, but underneath the carefulness there was something raw and complicated. He left before dawn, best I can tell, before anyone was up. The kitchen was quiet. Denny had gone very still near the stove. The safe in my office, Granger said. He had a key. I should have changed it after... He stopped. He took the operating cash. Not all of it. Enough. She looked at him steadily. How much? $300. He said it like a man reporting a wound. And the deed copies. She felt something tighten in her chest. The originals? Still in the county records office. He can't do anything with copies. He paused. I don't think he can do anything with copies. Then that's the first thing we find out, she said. Today, when the road clears, someone goes to the county office and confirms the originals are intact and gets certified copies made that live somewhere he doesn't have access to. I know. He looked at her. You're not surprised he ran. I'm not surprised, she said. He came to see me last night, during the storm. He knew I had the documentation. He understood what was coming. You should have told me. It was 2 a.m. during a blizzard with 14 men in my kitchen, she said. I'm telling you now. He absorbed that without pushing back on it, which she'd learned was one of the things about him that was genuinely decent. He didn't argue with correct sequencing just because it inconvenienced him. The attorney in Denver, she said, the one I sent the ledger documentation to, he needs to know Silas has fled. That changes the legal picture. Granger looked at her. You sent 3 weeks ago. I told you I had documentation. I didn't tell you I'd already sent copies to someone qualified to do something with them. She watched his face work through it. I needed it somewhere safe before I said anything out loud. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. He was quiet for a longer moment than usual. You were protecting the evidence, he said finally. Yes. From Silas. Yes. And from the possibility that I might... He stopped. That you might not believe me or might tell Silas before you'd decided what to do about it, she said. I didn't know you well enough then. The honesty of that sat between them in the cold kitchen air. He didn't flinch from it, which told her what she'd suspected for weeks now about what kind of man he actually was underneath the exhausted management of an impossible situation. Do you know me well enough now? He said. Better, she said. He put his hat back on. I'll get a rider to Denver as soon as the road clears. Who's the attorney? A man named Hargrove, Elias Hargrove. He has an office on Larimer Street. She paused. Tell him Martha Bell sent you. He'll know what it means. Granger nodded. At the door, he stopped. Martha. She looked up from the store's inventory she'd already started. Thank you, he said, for last night, for all of it. She nodded once. He left. Denny, at the stove, said nothing. But she could see from the angle of his shoulders that he was working very hard at appearing to be focused exclusively on the coffee. Not a word, she said. I didn't say anything, he said. Good. She went back to the inventory. The week that followed the storm was the hardest sustained stretch of work Martha had done since arriving at Ironwood Ridge, and that was saying something. With Silas gone, the entire structure of the ranch's daily operations had to be redistributed across people who hadn't been doing those jobs and were still figuring out which parts of them they could do and which parts needed someone else. Granger handled the overall decisions. Calloway, who had been doing pieces of the foreman's work quietly for months without the title or pay, stepped into the gap with the slightly grim efficiency of a man who has been watching someone else do a job badly for a long time and has finally been given the opportunity to do it correctly. But the administrative side, the books, the supply accounts, the outstanding debts and arrangements that Silas had managed, some correctly and some not, that landed on the kitchen table at the end of every day because the kitchen was where Granger came when he needed to think, and Martha was there and she was good at numbers and he was not too proud to say so. The debt picture, when they laid it out fully for the first time, was not good. She sat across from him at the kitchen table on the 4th evening after the storm, the lamp between them and the account book spread across the surface, and she added the columns a second time because she didn't like the answer from the first time and wanted to be sure. The answer was the same. 4,200, she said. Give or take what Silas may have misrecorded in the final months. Granger had his hands flat on the table. He was looking at the numbers with the expression of a man who has been suspecting the size of a thing for a long time and finds, upon finally seeing it clearly, that his suspicion was correct and that this is not the relief he'd hoped it would be. The ranch brings in, he started, about $3,000 a year in a good year, she said, after costs. Less in a drought year, which the last two have been. She paused. There's also the note on the north pasture land. That's not in these accounts. I know about the note. It matures in 8 months. I know. She sat back and let him think. That was the other thing she'd learned about Wyatt Granger. He wasn't a man who thought better with someone pushing him. He thought better with space and honesty and silence, which were 3 things she was capable of providing in a reasonable supply. My father, he said finally, built this ranch on the idea that if you treated your land and your workers right, the land would pay you back. He said it carefully, as if checking each word before he used it. He was right about that. When he was running it, this place did well. Better than well. He looked at the accounts. I came back and I trusted the wrong man to run the day-to-day while I managed the bigger decisions. And the bigger decisions turned out to be built on bad information from the day-to-day, which means the bigger decisions were wrong, she said. Not because you were careless, because you were working with false numbers. It's the same result. It's a different problem, which means it has a different solution. He looked at her. What's the solution? She'd been thinking about it for 3 days. The ranch itself is sound, she said. The land, the cattle operation, the fundamentals. Silas didn't damage those. He stole cash and supplies, which is recoverable if you can stabilize the operation and give it time to earn. The attorney in Denver, if he can get the theft documented legally, may be able to establish a claim against Silas's property for some portion of what was taken. She paused. That's not guaranteed and it's not fast. The immediate problem is the debt and the note. I can't pay either right now. No, but you can negotiate. She put her finger on the account book. The men who hold this debt, have you spoken to them directly? Not through Silas, directly. He was quiet. Silas managed those relationships, he said. Then they have a distorted picture of this ranch's situation, she said. They've been getting information from a man who had reasons to make the situation look worse than it was. A man whose departure they may or may not yet know about. She met his eyes. If you go to them directly with real numbers and a realistic plan for paying back what's owed over a workable timeline, some of them may prefer that to the uncertainty of calling the notes. Some, he said. Some is better than none, she said. And none is what you have right now. He looked at the accounts for a while. Then he looked at her. How do you know how to do? He said. Do what? Think about money this way, like it's a problem with a shape. She considered the question honestly. My mother ran a household on very little for a long time, she said. She taught me that money is just a language. You have to learn to read it the way you read everything else, without looking away from the hard parts. I was quiet for a moment. She taught you the biscuits too? Yes. She sounds like she was something. She was, Martha said, and left it there because some things were complete in themselves. Over the following week, Granger made 3 trips to town. He came back from the first one with the news that Elias Hargrove in Denver had received the documentation and had already begun the legal process of documenting the theft. He came back from the second with the information that 2 of the 4 creditors had agreed to restructured payment terms. Not generous terms, but workable ones. He came back from the third with something she hadn't expected. News that Silas Crow had been found in a town south of the Colorado border, and that the county sheriff, not the local sheriff who was indeed Silas's friend, but the county authority above him, had been in contact with Hargrove's office. He told her all of this at the kitchen table, and she listened to each piece and asked the questions that needed asking, and when he was done, she got up and poured them both coffee and sat back down and said, "What are you going to do about Callaway?" He looked at her. He's been doing the foreman's work since Silas left, she said. He was doing parts of it before that. He knows this ranch better than anyone except you. I know. He hasn't said anything about it. He won't. That's not how he is. I know that too. Granger wrapped his hands around the cup. I've been thinking about it. Think faster, she said. He's 62 years old, and he's working the job of a man 30 years younger without the pay or the title, and he'll do it indefinitely without complaining, which is exactly why you need to stop waiting and offer it to him before he decides you don't intend to. Granger looked at her with the expression that had become familiar over the past weeks, the slightly startled look of a man encountering a perspective he'd had access to the whole time and hadn't quite reached. "You're right," he said. "I usually am," she said, "about practical things." The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile yet, but it was in that territory. He offered Calloway the foreman position the next morning. Calloway's response, as reported by Denny, who'd been within earshot, was, "Took you long enough," which was, Martha thought, exactly the right response. The ranch began to change in the way that things change when the fundamental problem has been identified and addressed, and the remaining work is real, but no longer operating against a hidden current. Not fast, not dramatically, but measurably. Calloway reorganized the work assignments within the first week of officially becoming foreman, and the reorganization was the kind that could only be done by someone who had been paying close attention for years, putting men to tasks that matched what they were actually good at, rather than what they'd always been assigned. Amos and Dutch, it turned out, had significant skill with the kind of repair and construction work the ranch needed done on its fences and outbuildings, skill that had been wasted on general labor because Silas had never bothered to find out what any of them were good at beyond what they'd been hired to do. Hector, whose hands healed over the following month with only the minor lasting sensitivity she'd predicted, turned out to have a facility with the horses that nobody had known about because nobody had given him consistent access to the right horses. Granger moved him to the stable management side of operations and productivity. They improved visibly within 2 weeks. Denny turned 17 and a half and started asking Calloway questions about ranch management with the relentless, slightly exhausting thoroughness of a person who has found the thing they're actually interested in. Calloway answered all of them, at length, with the patient thoroughness of a man who'd been waiting for someone to ask. Martha watched all of it from the kitchen and from the increasing number of places she found herself outside the kitchen. That was the part she hadn't anticipated. She had come to cook. She had understood her role as the kitchen, the food, the warmth, the practical care that came through those things. But the ranch had a way of expanding the definition. Men came to her with things that weren't kitchen problems, and she dealt with them because she was there and she was the person they'd learned to bring things to. Pete, the man who went quiet on Sundays, came to her one evening in February with a letter he'd received from his daughter in Ohio that he couldn't quite read without his glasses, which he'd broken 2 months ago and hadn't replaced. She read it to him. His daughter was well. She'd had a baby. Pete's first grandchild, a boy. Pete sat at the kitchen table for a long time after, not crying exactly, just very still. The way a man gets when something has reached him too deep to come out as any specific expression. "You should write to her," Martha said. "Today." "I'm not much for writing," he said. "I'll help you," she said. "After supper." They wrote the letter together over an hour, Pete talking and Martha finding the words for what he was trying to say, which was simply that he loved his daughter and he was proud of her and he was sorry he wasn't there. When they were done, he read it back to himself slowly, moving his lips, and then he folded it very carefully. "That's what I meant," he said. "That's exactly what I meant." "I know," she said. He went to post it the next morning. She did not think of these things as remarkable. They were simply what needed doing, found her, and got done. That was the texture of her days. The cooking, which was always first, and then the accumulated small necessities of 43 men living far from whatever had once been home. What she did notice, over the weeks of February and into March, was the change in how those men moved through their days. The particular heaviness she'd observed when she arrived, the suppressed, downtrodden quality of men who had learned that effort didn't produce reward, that the place they lived didn't see them, that was lifting. Not all at once, not for everyone simultaneously, but progressively, unevenly, the way warmth returns to a cold limb, in patches and degrees. Men stood differently at supper. They argued about things. Real arguments, the productive kind, about how to do a job better, about which approach to the spring cattle drive made more sense, about whether Dutch's fence repair technique or Amos's fence repair technique was superior, a debate that had been running for 3 weeks and showed no sign of resolution and clearly meant a great deal to both of them. They made plans. They talked about staying through the summer, through next winter, about what the ranch could look like in 2 years if things continued on the current trajectory. She heard all of this from the kitchen, through the open window when the weather allowed, and through the wall when it didn't. Granger heard it too. She knew because he mentioned it to her one evening in the kitchen. Not with any particular drama, just as an observation, the way he reported practical things. "They're talking about the fall roundup," he said. "Already, it's March." "I know," she said. 2 months ago, they were talking about leaving, most of them." "I know that too." He looked at his coffee cup. "What's changed?" She considered the question. It deserved a real answer. They started to believe the place was worth staying for, she said, which means they started to believe they were worth staying for. Those two things are the same thing in the end. He was quiet. It wasn't the food, she added. The food was just the first thing. The first thing just needs to be real. After that, people will supply a lot of the rest themselves if you clear the way. He looked at her across the table. The lamp was burning steadily and the kitchen was warm, and outside the March wind was doing its indeterminate thing. Not quite winter anymore, not yet spring. You cleared a lot of way, he said. So did you, she said. You made the decisions that mattered. Calloway, Hector, the creditors, those were your decisions. Based on your thinking. Based on what was true, she said. I just said it out loud. He held her gaze for a moment longer than the conversation required. She was aware of it, and she was aware of being aware of it, and she made the practical decision to pick up the empty cups and carry them to the wash basin. There's something I've been meaning to ask you, he said. She kept her back to him, working on the cups. Ask. The job. What I've been paying you. She turned around. He had his hands on the table in the direct, slightly awkward posture of a man who has been rehearsing something and is not sure the rehearsal was adequate. It's not what you're worth, he said, by a significant margin. And I've been... He stopped. I know the ranch is still getting stable. I know the finances aren't where they should be yet, but I want you to know that I'm aware of it, and I intend to correct it as soon as I'm in a position to. She looked at him for a moment. I know, she said. You know? You're an honest man, Wyatt, she said. It was the first time she'd used his given name without being prompted, and they both noticed it. You're not always a fast one, but you're honest. I've known you'd correct it when you could. He looked at her. The careful expression had changed into something that was less carefully managed, something that had some of its actual shape showing. Is that enough? He said. Knowing? She thought about it honestly. For now, she said, ask me again in a year. It wasn't the answer he'd been expecting. She could tell by the way he absorbed it, the slight recalibration, the thing that moved across his face before he controlled it. A year, he said. Things look different in a year, she said. The ranch will be different, you'll be different, I might be different. She paused. Decisions made in a good kitchen in March are sometimes better made after the summer's work tells you what the ranch actually needs. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You're not easy. No, she said, I'm not. I'm not complaining. I know you're not. He pushed back from the table and stood. At the door he stopped, in the way he always stopped, because he was a man who regularly remembered the last thing after he'd started to leave. The attorney sent a final accounting of what Silas took, he said, over the 14 months, total. How much? $1,140. He said it the way you say a number that has cost you a significant amount of feeling to arrive at, plus the $300 from the safe. She was quiet. Hargrove thinks we have a solid case. Silas owned property in his name, a parcel north of town he bought 2 years ago. He paused. Cash purchase. There it is, she said softly. Yeah. His voice was level and tired. There it is. He put his hand on the door frame. You built something here, Martha. I want you to know I see that. She nodded. Good night, he said. Good night. He went out. She stood in the kitchen for a while after, not doing anything particular, just being in it. The warmth, the quiet, the sound of the ranch settling into its evening. Somewhere in the bunkhouse, the harmonica was going again. Tuneless, cheerful, the same player who'd been at it since her first weeks here and had, if anything, gotten slightly better. Or she'd gotten more used to it. She turned out the lamp. In the dark, she put her hand on the biscuit tin and felt its edges. Battered, reliable, worn smooth in the places her hands always found. Her mother had cooked with less than this. Had made a home in harder places with fewer tools and no certainty about how any of it would turn out. Martha had learned over the years that certainty was mostly a thing you believed in after the fact. A story you told about decisions that had already been made. While you were making them, all you had was what you knew and what you were willing to do with it. She knew this ranch. She knew these men. She knew what it had cost and what it had become and what it still needed. That was enough to work with. It always had been. She went to bed. Outside, the harmonica played on into the Colorado dark, and she let it follow her to sleep. Spring came to Ironwood Ridge the way it always came to high Colorado. Reluctantly, in pieces, with several false starts that fooled nobody who'd lived through a mountain winter before. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes first. revealing ground that was soft and dark and smelled like something that had been waiting a long time. The north pasture held its white until late April, when a week of genuine warmth finally convinced it to let go. The creek that ran along the eastern property line, which had been locked solid since November, broke up over 3 days with a sound like distant artillery that brought 3 of the younger hands out of the bunkhouse at dawn, thinking something had happened. Martha heard it from the kitchen and knew what it was and kept her hands in the bread dough. The legal proceedings against Silas Crowe had moved through the winter with the grinding, unsatisfying pace of legal things, which was to say, slower than anyone wanted and faster than Martha had feared. Elias Hargrove, the Denver attorney, turned out to be exactly the kind of man she'd hoped he would be when she'd found his name in a months-old newspaper and written him a careful letter. Methodical, thorough, not easily discouraged. He'd built the case against Silas the way she built a meal, from what was actually available, not from what would have been ideal. The core of it was the ledger documentation she'd sent him in December, cross-referenced with the ranch's actual supply receipts and the testimony of 3 hands who had, over the winter, decided that what they'd seen and stayed quiet about deserved a different response now that the man they'd been afraid of was gone. Calloway had been one of them. Hector had been another. The third had been Pete, who'd sat in Martha's kitchen for an hour before he was willing to talk, and then talked for 2 hours without stopping. Because it turned out, Pete had seen quite a lot during 4 years of keeping his head down and not saying so. The property settlement came through on a Tuesday in late March. Granger rode back from town with the papers in his coat and came directly to the kitchen, which was where he always came when something had happened that he needed to think about in company. She was making the midday meal. He sat down without being invited and put the papers on the table and looked at them. Hargrove got the judgment, he said. She turned from the stove. The land parcel? The parcel and the cash Silas had left after Hargrove's fees. He put his hand flat on the papers. $912 recovered, and the parcel sells at whatever the market gives. Hargrove estimates another $400 to $600. She turned back to the stove and adjusted the heat under the pot and let the number settle. That's the note, she said. Most of it. Most of it is enough to renegotiate the rest. Yeah, his voice was quiet. Yeah, it is. She heard him exhale, not dramatically, just the particular exhalation of a man who has been holding something in his chest for a long time and has finally been given a reason to set it down. She let him have the moment without filling it. There's something else, he said. She waited. The county reviewed the foreman records as part of the case. The way Silas had been documenting the ranch's operating expenses, there's a question about back taxes. Whether some of the losses he reported were legitimate deductions or whether he was manipulating the tax records the same way he manipulated the supply books. He paused. It's not a crisis. Hargrove says it's manageable. But I have to go to Denver in April and sit down with the county assessor and Hargrove together and go through 4 years of records. She put down the spoon. Do you want me to come? He looked up. I'm through the books, she said. I know where the discrepancies are. I know how to explain what's Silas's manipulation and what's genuine operating loss. She paused. You'd be walking into that room with a better hand if I was in it with you. He looked at her for a long moment. That's 4 days, he said. Denver and back. The kitchen won't collapse without me for 4 days. Denny can manage the basics. She raised an eyebrow slightly. Unless you think I'm wrong about what I'd add. I don't think you're wrong, he said. He said it simply, without hesitation, which was the thing she'd come to appreciate most about Wyatt Granger. When he'd decided something was true, he said so without decoration. I think you're usually right about what you'd add. Then I'll come to Denver. He nodded. Then, after a moment, you've never been? Once, years ago, I passed through on my way west. She went back to the stove. I didn't see much of it. It's bigger than it used to be. Most things are. He picked up the legal papers and folded them back into his coat. At the door, he said, without turning around, Martha, thank you for the letter to Hargrove, for all of it. She said, You've thanked me before. I know. I'll probably do it again. Then I'll keep accepting it graciously, she said. Go tell Calloway about the judgment. He's been waiting. She heard him cross the yard. A minute later, she heard from the direction of the barn a single loud sound from Calloway that wasn't quite a word, just a short, forceful release of air that, in a less composed man, would have been a shout. She allowed herself a small, private moment with that sound. Then she went back to the midday meal. Denver, when they arrived in the second week of April, was exactly as Granger had described it, bigger than it used to be and not always gracefully so. The city had that quality of having grown faster than it had thought about how to grow, streets and buildings in various stages of construction and ambition, mud and progress in equal measure. She was aware, traveling with him, of how they looked together, a man and a woman, not young, arriving by rail and moving through a city on business. She was aware of the looks, and she was aware that they didn't trouble her the way looks had once troubled her, or the way being shoved into mud by a foreman had been intended to trouble her. She had come to Denver to do a job, and she was going to do it. The meeting with Hargrove and the county assessor lasted most of 2 days. Hargrove was a small, precise man with an unexpectedly dry sense of humor that emerged at intervals like something testing the weather. He shook Martha's hand when they arrived and said, "Miss Bell, you write an economical letter," which was the highest compliment she could imagine from someone whose profession required reading a great deal of bad writing, and she said, "I had clarity of purpose." And he said, "That came through," and they understood each other. The assessor was a more difficult proposition. A man named Birch, who had the particular quality of someone who considers himself to be acting from principle when he is in fact acting from caution, and who therefore needed to be met with the kind of patient, documented specificity that made caution feel more costly than agreement. Martha had spent 2 weeks before the trip preparing for exactly that. She had the 4 years of records organized by type and year, the discrepancies in Silas's entries flagged in her own notation, and the actual operating costs reconstructed from the physical evidence of the ranch's genuine expenses. She didn't argue with Birch. She laid things out. By the second afternoon, Hargrove was handling most of the conversation, and she was supplementing when he needed specificity. She had that he didn't, and by the end of it, Birch had agreed to a reassessment that treated Silas's fraudulent loss claims as what they were. Theft from the tax record, not legitimate deduction, which meant the ranch's liability was significantly less than Birch's initial position. Walking out of the county building into the April afternoon, Granger said nothing for half a block. Then he said, "You prepared for this for 2 weeks. About that, you didn't tell me what you were doing. I told you I'd be useful in the room," she said. "I didn't think you needed a detailed preview." He looked at her sideways. "Most people would have wanted credit for the preparation." "I want the outcome," she said. "The credit follows or it doesn't." They ate supper that evening at a restaurant near the hotel. A proper restaurant, linen on the tables, the kind of meal Martha rarely ate because she was usually the one making it. She ate with the particular attention of someone assessing another kitchen's choices, which she couldn't entirely turn off, and Granger noticed and said, "Can you eat without evaluating it?" "Probably not," she said. "The sauce on this is too heavy. They're compensating for something." "The beef is good," he said. "The beef is excellent," she agreed. "They didn't need the sauce." He looked at her across the table with an expression that had been accumulating over the months she'd known him. The specific look of a man who has been finding a person surprising for long enough that the surprise has become something else. Something that has moved past the stage of surprise into something more settled and more serious. She had been aware of it for a while. She'd been waiting, with the same patience she brought to everything, to see what he intended to do with it. "I want to ask you something," he said. "You can ask me anything," she said. "I might not answer." "You usually do." "Usually." He set down his fork. "When I offered you the position in January, full salary, what you're actually worth, you said ask again in a year, that you wanted to see what the ranch looked like after the summer." "I remember." "It's April. It's not a year yet." "No," he said, "but I'm not asking about salary." She met his eyes. "The ranch is going to make it," he said. "I know that now. The judgment, the reassessment, the operation running the way Callaway's running it. We're going to come through this year in a better position than I've been in since my father died. That's real. That's not optimism." He paused. "And most of why that's true is sitting across this table from me." She was quiet. "I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean," he said. "I know you're not. And I'm not going to tell you how I feel about you and then let it sit there and see what you do with it. That's not He stopped. "I'm not good at this part, the saying it part. I've had more practice at not saying things." "You're doing all right," she said. He looked at her. "Is that encouragement?" "It's an honest assessment." He almost smiled. Didn't quite. "I want to know if there's a future where we're partners, in the full meaning of that. Not just the work, though the work is real and I respect it and it's not nothing, but everything." He held her gaze. "I want to know if that's something you'd consider." She looked at him across the table, at his face that she'd been reading for months now. the careful arrangement of it, the thing underneath the arrangement, the tiredness and the decency and the specific way he had of going still when something mattered to him. She thought about the mud on her coat on the first day and the key in his hand and the kitchen at midnight with the storm outside. She thought about 14 months of ledger entries and the attorney in Denver and the biscuit tin on the shelf. She thought about what her mother had told her once, in a kitchen smaller than the one at Ironwood Ridge, about the difference between what people showed you and what they did when showing you things cost them something. Wyatt Granger had been showing her, for 6 months, what he did when things cost him something. She had been paying attention. "I consider it," she said. "I'm not going to tell you yes or no tonight, not because I don't know my own mind. I know my own mind, but because I think we should both be sure, and being sure takes longer than one dinner in Denver." "How long?" he said. "When we get back to the ranch," she said, "ask me again. After the spring work is done and we can see what the summer looks like, and neither of us is sitting in a restaurant in a city that doesn't belong to either of us." She paused. "Ask me at the ranch. That's where the answer is." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. One of those nods, the kind that held more than nods usually hold. "All right," he said. They finished supper. They walked back to the hotel through the April Denver evening, the city loud around them with its own business, and didn't say anything in particular, and it was a comfortable not saying, the kind that only exists between people who have already said enough of the things that matter. They were back at Ironwood Ridge by the end of the week. Denny had managed the kitchen with the determined competence of a person who has been entrusted with something and refuses to fail it, which meant the meals had been functional if not inspired, and nothing had burned down, which was the standard Martha had privately set for him and which he had met. He reported on the 4 days with the thoroughness of a written inventory, including the fact that Amos had cut his hand on the 3rd day and been taken care of with the supplies on the windowsill, and that 2 of the new spring calves had been born, and that Pete had received a letter from his daughter containing a photograph of the baby, which Pete had shown to every person on the ranch individually. Martha listened to all of this at the kitchen table with her coat still on and her bag at her feet, and when Denny was done, she said, "Thank you. You did well." He straightened slightly, in the way he straightened when he was trying not to look pleased. "The biscuits were a little flat on the 2nd day," he admitted. "What did you do differently?" "I think I worked the dough too much." "That's the most common mistake," she said. "Less handling, not more. The more you work it, the tougher it gets." He nodded, filing it. He'd been filing things for months. She'd started to understand, somewhere in February, that Denny was going to be all right, not just here, but anywhere, because he had the particular combination of humility and persistence that was rarer than either quality alone. Spring moved into its working season, and the ranch moved with it. The cattle work that spring was the most organized it had been, by every measure, since Calloway had taken over as foreman. He ran the drive south to the grazing pastures with the efficiency of a man who had spent years watching how it should have been done and was finally doing it that way. Granger worked alongside his men in a way he hadn't in the Silas years. Not because he'd been unwilling before, but because in the Silas years, there had always been something administrative pulling him back, some crisis or discrepancy or conversation that turned out later to have been manufactured to keep him occupied and away from direct observation of the operation. Without that, he was on horseback with his hands from dawn most days, and the effect was not just practical but visible in the way the men worked. There was a different quality to the effort when the man whose name was on the land was in it alongside you, sharing the same cold mornings and the same hard decisions. Martha saw him come in at the end of those days carrying the particular weariness of real physical work, which is different from the weariness of management and worry. He ate well. He slept, she was told by Calloway, with an air of reporting a significant development through the night. She worked. She always worked. The spring kitchen was its own kind of demanding. More men moving through the day, more irregular hours, more need for food that could be prepared ahead and kept warm and still be worth eating when it finally reached someone. She adapted. She always adapted. What she also did in the spaces between meals and the quiet hours was think. She thought about what he'd asked her in Denver. She thought about herself, who she was, which was something she'd had more occasion to examine in the 6 months at Ironwood Ridge than in the several years before it combined. She thought about what partnership meant in its full sense, and what she would need it to mean to be worth saying yes to. She had never been a woman who believed that need was the basis for anything durable. She'd watched too many women arrive at decisions from need, the need for security, for a roof, for someone to make the practical difficulties of life less impossible. And she'd seen what those decisions looked like 5 years later. Not always badly. Sometimes the need and the genuine feeling aligned, and it worked. but she hadn't come to Ironwood Ridge from need. She'd come from exhaustion and determination and the specific stubbornness of a woman who refused to stop looking for the place where her work was worth something. She had found that place. The question was whether finding it meant staying in it, and whether staying in it meant what he was asking her if it meant. She was at the stove on a Tuesday morning in late May when she arrived at the answer. Not because anything particular happened that morning. No dramatic revelation, no scene. She was making the breakfast biscuits, her hands in the dough, and she was thinking about the ranch as it was right now versus the ranch as it had been on the day she'd walked through the gate, and she realized that what she felt about the difference wasn't professional satisfaction. It was love. The specific, complicated, difficult love of a person for a place they've put themselves into fully. For the people in it, for the work of it. And then she thought about Wyatt Granger, and the specific, complicated feeling attached to that thought was not substantially different from the feeling attached to the ranch, which was either a problem or a clarity. And she decided, with the same plain honesty she brought to supply inventories and ledger discrepancies and everything else that required looking at what was actually there, that it was a clarity. She put the biscuits in the oven. He came into the kitchen that evening, as he did most evenings now, with the late light behind him and the sound of the ranch settling into its end of day. He poured himself coffee and sat at the table, and she finished what she was doing at the stove, and then she turned around and sat down across from him. He looked at her. He read her face, which he'd gotten good at over 6 months, and something in him went very still. "Ask me," she said. He set down the cup. "Martha." "Ask me at the ranch," she'd told him. "That's where the answer is." He understood. "Will you be my partner?" he said. "In everything." "Yes," she said, "with conditions." He waited. "Equal say in the decisions that matter," she said. "Not deference to you because you were here first, and not deference from you because I'm a woman. Actual equal say. We disagree, we work it out. We don't work it out, we try again. We're not performing a partnership. We're doing it." "Agreed," he said, without hesitation. "My name on the deed," she said. "Not immediately. I understand the legal process takes time. But before a year is out." He held her gaze. "Agreed. And I keep the kitchen," she said. "Not because that's my place. Because it's the work I'm good at and it matters to this ranch, and I'm not giving it up to become something decorative." He almost smiled. "I would never ask you to be something decorative." "No," she said. "I don't think you would. I'm saying it anyway." "Agreed," he said. "Martha." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not a grand gesture, just his hand, warm and calloused and direct. "I know what you brought here. I know what it cost you to walk through that gate and stay." "You don't know all of it," she said. "No," he said. "I'd like to." She looked at his hand over hers, at the kitchen around them. Her kitchen, genuinely hers now, in a way that had nothing to do with the deed and everything to do with the 6 months of work that had made it so. The biscuit tin on the shelf, the stove drawing well, the sounds of the ranch outside the window. "Then you'll have time," she said. "We both will." He turned her hand over and held it properly, and she let him. What happened next didn't happen all at once. That was the truth of it, and it was worth saying plainly because the stories people told about this kind of thing, about two people deciding to build something together, tended to skip over the actual process of building in favor of the moment of decision, as if the decision was the thing. It wasn't. The decision was only the permission. The thing was everything after. The summer of that year was hard in the specific ways that cattle summers on the Colorado frontier were hard. Heat, drought in August that worried everyone. A fence dispute with a neighboring operation that required 3 weeks of careful negotiation before it was resolved without lawyers. A bout of illness that moved through the bunkhouse in July and put 6 men down for a week, and Martha in the kitchen around the clock producing the particular foods that sick men could manage and the rest of the ranch needed simultaneously. She and Granger argued twice that summer. Real arguments, not disagreements. The kind that ended with both of them in separate rooms with their separate certainties, stewing. The first was about the fence dispute. She thought he was being too accommodating to the neighbor's position and said so directly, and he told her she didn't understand the history of the relationship between the two ranches. And she said the history of the relationship seemed to be working in the neighbor's favor, and they didn't speak properly for 2 days before he came to the kitchen and said, "I think you were right about half of it." And she said, "I think you were right about the other half," and they worked out a combined position that resolved the dispute better than either of their individual positions would have. The second argument was about money. specifically about how to allocate the summer's profits between debt repayment and operational reinvestment. She wanted more toward the debt and faster. He wanted to keep more working capital in the operation because he'd been through a drought year with insufficient reserves and knew what that looked like. They were both right. It took them 4 days and 2 kitchen table sessions with the account books spread between them to arrive at a number they both believed in. Those arguments mattered. She would have worried about the partnership without them. By October, the ranch had paid off the note on the north pasture land. Granger came home from town with the paid-off papers on a Wednesday afternoon and stood in the kitchen doorway holding them without saying anything, and she looked at his face, and she put down what she was doing and crossed the kitchen and took his hand. "Your father would have wanted this," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I know." His voice was not quite steady. "I know he would." She didn't say anything else. She just held his hand until he was ready to move. Calloway organized a celebration that weekend. Not on her instigation or Granger's, but on his own, because Calloway understood the ranch's rhythms by this point as well as any of them. He acquired, through means he declined to specify, 3 bottles of decent whiskey and a quantity of food from town that supplemented Martha's own preparations. And on the Saturday evening, every man on the ranch gathered around the fire that Amos and Dutch had built in the center of the yard, which was too big to be a practical fire and exactly the right size for what it was. Martha made 6 pans of biscuits for the occasion. She made them the way her mother had taught her, with the buttermilk and the proper fold and the particular attention to heat that made the difference between a biscuit that was food and a biscuit that was something more than food. They went in 8 minutes. She had anticipated this and had 2 more pans ready. Denny, who was 18 now and had been learning the account books from her since February under the guise of kitchen inventory management. A fiction they had maintained by unspoken agreement because it gave him a way to learn without the vulnerability of openly asking. Came to her at the fire and said, "I want to do what you do." She looked at him. "Cook?" "Run things," he said, "the way you and Mr. Granger run them, knowing where everything is and what it costs and where it needs to go." He was looking at the fire, not at her, which was how 18-year-olds said serious things. "I think I could be good at it." "You are good at it," she said. "You've been doing it." He turned to look at her. The inventory was a cover. Of course it was. He processed this. "Why didn't you just offer to teach me directly?" "Because you would have been too proud to accept help directly," she said. "You need to think you were doing something practical and then discover you'd learned something larger. That's how most real learning works." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that how you learned?" "Some of it." She looked at the fire. "Some of it I learned because I had no other choice, and refusing to learn would have meant not surviving. I'd rather you get there with fewer of the second kind of lesson." He nodded slowly. The fire popped and sent a spray of sparks upward into the October dark. Around them, the ranch hands were talking and laughing with the particular looseness of people who have been through a hard year together and are now, for this evening, on the other side of it. "Martha," Denny said. "Can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask." "When you walked through that gate in November, did you know it was going to turn out this way?" She thought about it honestly. The mud and the tin in her arms and Silas's hand on her coat. The kitchen that smelled of old grease. The first pan of biscuits going out to men who had forgotten what a real meal felt like. "No," she said. "I knew I was going to work. I knew the work was going to be real. Everything else," she paused. "You don't know how things are going to turn out. You know what you're willing to do with what's in front of you. That's all you get." He turned that over. She could see him taking it seriously, the way he took things seriously now that he'd stopped performing being serious and was actually becoming it. "Is that enough?" he said. "It's been enough for me," she said. Pete came by with the whiskey bottle and offered it around with the solemnity of a man performing an important function, which he was. Martha declined, and Pete moved on to Hector, who accepted with the appreciation of someone whose hands, fully recovered now, still reminded him occasionally of the north fence line in November. Hector had written to Rosaria 3 times since the storm. Rosaria had written back. Martha knew this because Hector had asked her once, with the careful indirectness of a man asking for something he wasn't sure he was entitled to ask for, whether she might look over a letter he'd written and tell him if it said what he meant to say. She'd read it and told him it said exactly what he meant to say, and he should send it. She'd asked if Rosaria was his sister. He'd said yes, and then, after a pause, "She had a hard year. I should have written sooner." "You wrote," Martha had said. That's what matters now. He'd sent the letter that afternoon. The legal proceedings against Silas Crowe concluded in September. The judgment was final. The recovered funds from the property sale came through in full, and the combination of that and the summer's earnings cleared the main operating debt with enough left over to establish, for the first time in 3 years, a working reserve. Hargrove wrote a letter congratulating Granger on the outcome, and noting in the dry, economical way that Martha had come to appreciate about his correspondence, that he'd rarely seen documentation so clearly prepared. Granger read the letter aloud at the kitchen table and then looked at her over the top of it. "He means you," he said. "He means both of us," she said. "You walked into that room in Denver. You built the case he walked in with. Then we both get the credit," she said. "That's how partnership works." He put down the letter and looked at her in the way he'd been looking at her more often lately, with something that was past the stage of surprise and appreciation and had become something more settled, more permanent. The look of a man who has stopped waiting to see if something is real and has accepted that it is. "The deed amendment goes through next week," he said. Hargrove confirmed it. She nodded. "You're not going to make a comment about that?" he said. "What kind of comment should I make? Most people would have something to say about their name going on a deed." "My name going on the deed is appropriate recognition of what I've contributed to this ranch," she said. "I'm glad it's happening. That doesn't require a comment." He was quiet for a moment, then, "You are the most practical person I have ever met. That's not the worst thing to be." "I know," he said. "I wasn't complaining." She looked at him across the kitchen table, the October evening coming in through the small window, the fire sounds from the yard carrying through the walls. She thought about what she'd told Denny, that you don't know how things are going to turn out, only what you're willing to do with what's in front of you. What was in front of her was this kitchen, this ranch, these men with their cracked hands and their letters home and their harmonica in the evenings and their capacity for laughter that she'd watched return, meal by meal, over the past 12 months. What was in front of her was Wyatt Granger, imperfect and honest and better than he'd been when she'd met him, which was something she could say about herself too. "I want to tell you something," she said. He waited. "I've worked in a lot of kitchens," she said. "I've been in a lot of places where my job was to make things better than I found them and then leave when the job was done or when I was made to feel I wasn't welcome anymore." She paused. "I've never had a place that was mine, not in the way this is mine." He was very still. "I'm not saying that because of the deed," she said. "The deed is paper. I'm saying it because I put myself into this place and it gave something back, and that doesn't happen everywhere you work. It doesn't happen most places." She looked at her hands on the table. Flour still in the creases, the particular rough quality of hands that work in water and heat daily. "I want you to know I know what this is worth." "I know you know," he said quietly. "I want you to know I'm not going anywhere." He reached across and covered her hands with his, the same way he'd done in Denver, and she let him. And they sat in the kitchen as the evening came on and the fire in the yard burned down from celebration to ordinary warmth. Outside, Denny started on the harmonica. He'd been practicing all year. He was, at this point, marginally better than he had been, which was to say still inconsistent, but occasionally surprising. Tonight he found a tune and stayed with it for almost a full minute before losing the thread. Calloway said something to him that made 3 men laugh. Denny found the tune again. A year from now, Martha Bell's name would be on the deed to Ironwood Ridge Ranch, and she would stand in the county office in her good coat with Wyatt Granger beside her and sign the document with the same plain, unhurried attention she brought to everything. And the clerk would look at her signature and then at her, and she would meet his eyes with the calm of someone who has nothing to prove and knows it. But that was a year from now. Tonight she was in her kitchen, in the ranch she'd made matter, listening to a boy learn to play a song properly by playing it wrong enough times to understand where wrong ended and right began. There was a lesson in that, she thought. There was a lesson in most things, if you were willing to stay in the room long enough to find it. She had learned to stay. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. More than enough most days. The staying, the working, the daily decision to put your hands to what was in front of you and not wait for someone to confirm that you were worth the effort. Nobody was going to tell you that. That wasn't how it went. You had decided it yourself, and then you proved it through the accumulation of days, and then one day you looked up from the work and found that the place around you had been changed by your presence in it, and the people in it had been changed, and you yourself had been changed, though you'd been too busy to notice the last one happening. Martha Bell had walked through the gate of Ironwood Ridge Ranch in November carrying a biscuit tin and a bag of worn clothes and a lifetime of being looked at and found wanting, and she had worked, and the work had been real, and the real work had been enough. The harmonica found its tune again and held it, and the fire in the yard sent its warmth against the walls of the kitchen, and inside, in the light, the ranch went on. The fence line running east, toward the pasture where the cattle were moving through their own mourning. The mountains beyond everything, present and enormous and indifferent in the way that mountains were, which was not cruelty but simply scale. They did not concern themselves with the human business at their feet, and there was something restful in that once you stopped needing them to. She thought about her mother. She did this sometimes in the early morning, in the space before the ranch woke up and the day made its demands. Her mother had cooked in a kitchen smaller than this one for most of her life, had made meals out of very little for people who needed them, had taught Martha everything she knew about food and about the particular dignity of work done well in a world that didn't always notice. Her mother had never owned land, had never had her name on a deed, had never been asked to sit across a table from a county assessor in Denver and explain the difference between fraudulent loss claims and legitimate operating expenses. But she had understood something that Martha understood now in a way she hadn't fully understood it when she was young. That what you built with your hands was yours in the way that mattered, regardless of what the paper said. The paper caught up eventually, or it didn't, and either way the work was already done. Martha's name was going on the deed next week. She let herself feel that, plainly, without performing it. Just the fact of it, sitting in her chest beside the coffee warmth and the stove heat and the sound of the ranch beginning to stir outside. Denny's boots on the bunkhouse steps, the soft complaint of the barn door, Calloway's voice, low and carrying, giving the day its first instructions. She set down the cup and began. First, the biscuits. Always the biscuits, her mother's recipe, the one that had opened a door in a place that had tried to close every door before it. Then the eggs and the side meat and the second pot of coffee for the men who needed 2 cups before they were fit for conversation, which was most of them. Hector appeared at the kitchen window at 6:30, which had become his habit since the winter. He didn't always say anything. Sometimes he just stood there for a moment as if checking that the kitchen was there and running, and then went about his morning. She'd come to understand this was his version of gratitude, not verbal, just the daily confirmation of presence. Today he said, "Letter from Rosaria." She looked up. His face had the particular quality it got when his sister wrote, open in a way it wasn't usually open. "Good news?" she said. "She's coming west," he said. "In the spring. She wants to see Colorado." Martha smiled. A real one. The kind that arrived without consulting her. "Tell her there's a kitchen here if she needs a meal when she arrives," she said. He nodded. Something in him settled. The way things settled in people when they'd been offered exactly the right thing in exactly the right amount. He went back to his morning. She went back to hers. The biscuits came out right. They always came out right now. Not because she'd become perfect at them, but because she'd made them enough times in this oven with this flour at this altitude, that she understood the particular variables of this kitchen and worked with them rather than against them. That was the whole of skill in the end, not mastery in the abstract. Mastery of the specific, actual conditions of the place you were in. She had mastered this place. She put the biscuits on the table and called the breakfast, and the men came in from the morning cold and filled the room with noise and steam and the ordinary chaos of 43 people beginning another day, and she moved through it the way she always moved through it, steady, attentive, making small adjustments, watching for what was needed and meeting it before it became a problem. Wyatt came in last. He always came in last. He filled his plate without ceremony and sat at the end of the table and ate with the appetite of a man who'd been up since before her, which she doubted was possible but chose not to contest. He caught her eye across the room. She gave him nothing dramatic, just a look that said, "I'm here, the kitchen is running, the biscuits are right, the ranch is standing." He gave her back the same look. That was enough. That had always been enough for people who understood that most of the important things in a life were not announced but simply continued day after day in the small, reliable actions that added up to something only visible from a distance. Martha Bell had walked a long way to get here. She intended to stay. Granger found her in the kitchen that evening after the supper dishes were done, the way he always found her. As if the kitchen were the natural ending point of any day that had started somewhere else. He sat down at the table and she poured 2 cups of coffee without being asked and sat across from him. He had something in his hand, a folded paper which he set on the table between them without ceremony. She looked at it. "Hargrove sent it early," he said. "Courier arrived this afternoon while you were in the supply shed." She unfolded it. Read it once. Read it again. Her name. On the deed. In the formal, slightly archaic language of legal documents that nonetheless managed, in this instance, to say something simple and true. Martha Bell. Co-owner. Ironwood Ridge Ranch. She folded it back along its creases and set it on the table and looked at it for a moment. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. Outside, the Colorado evening was doing what Colorado evenings did in late October, coming on fast and cold and clear, the stars appearing one at a time over the ridge like they were checking whether the world below was ready for them. "Your mother would have liked this," Wyatt said. Quietly. Not a question. Martha thought about that honestly. The small kitchen, the worn recipe cards, the particular way her mother had of standing at a stove as if she owned it regardless of whose name was on the building. She would have said the deed was just paper, Martha said. And she would have been right. She picked up her coffee, and she also would have been very pleased about the paper. Wyatt smiled, a full one this time, the kind she'd been watching come easier to him across the months, not guarded, not managed, just his. She smiled back. Outside, the first stars were fully out now, steady and cold and brilliant over the mountains. The ranch was quiet in the way it was quiet at this hour, not empty, but resting. 43 men in the bunkhouse, cattle on the south pasture, horses in the barn, the fence lines running straight and repaired to the edges of the land that had her name on it. She picked up the deed again, tucked it carefully into the pocket of her apron, and stood up to begin the next morning's prep. There was bread to set out to rise. There were always biscuits to make. Some things, she had learned, were worth doing every single day without question. Not because the day demanded it, but because you had decided that this was the life you were building, and you built it the same way you built anything that lasted. One honest day at a time, with good hands and a steady fire and the particular courage of a person who had finally found the place where her work was worth something, and had chosen, without reservation, to stay.